Hello all, and thank you for joining us in today's Leo lecture, short timely talks that offer innovation and inspiration from Hamline thought leaders. I'm Molly Glevy from the Alumni Relations Office, and I'm really pleased that you're able to join us today. We're actually celebrating Hamline's Homecoming and Alumni Weekend a little early all this week. This is our third Leo lecture of the week, and if you're interested in hearing any of our other events or seeing some of the things that we've been doing this week and throughout the weekend, please go to hamline.edu/alumni weekend. I am going to bring us through some of our regular housekeeping items as frankly kind of quickly as I can so we can hand the reins over to Professor Schultz. Few quick things: you will be muted and your camera will be off for today's presentation. If you have a question, please use the Q&A icon in your Zoom dashboard on your screen. Now, Dr. Schultz will try to take some questions perhaps during his talk. He's also going to save time for the end. One thing I would mention is don't feel like you need to wait till the end of his time to submit questions. Just go ahead and do that as they come up. One other thing, if we might not get to everybody's questions today, there are quite a few people who are joining us. So if we don't answer your question, please go ahead and either email alum@hamline.edu, or I know Professor Schultz is happy to field direct emails as well, and we will track those answers down for you. And for those who might be watching this Leo lecture after Friday, October 2nd, go ahead and do the same. You're welcome to email alum@hamline.edu at any time, and we can track down answers for you. If you have a question about the logistics of today's webinar, please use the chat icon on your Zoom dashboard. There's a few of us who are behind the scenes ready to troubleshoot if need be. And finally, be patient with us as we are presenting from different locations, and you could hear family members or lawnmowers or things like that. And with that, I will introduce our speaker for today. David Schultz is Distinguished Professor at University Professor of Political Science and Legal Studies. He has a BA and MA in Political Science and Philosophy, a JD and LLM in Law, a PhD in Political Science, and a master's degree in Astronomy. A three-time Fulbright Scholar who has taught extensively in Europe and Asia, and the winner of the Leslie A. Whittington National Award for Excellence in Public Affairs Teaching, David is the author of more than 35 books and 200 articles on various aspects of American politics, election law, and the media and politics. He is regularly interviewed and quoted in local, national, and international media on these subjects, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, The Economist, and NPR. His most recent books are Encyclopedia of Money in American Politics and the Presidential Swing States. Prior to teaching, Professor Schultz also served as a city director of code enforcement, zoning, and planning in Binghamton, New York, and worked as a housing and economic planner for a community action agency. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Schultz.
Great, thank you very much, Molly. I appreciate that. And am I supposed, if I want to put something here, do I use chat or Q&A to put something in here? I want to put 4 numbers in.
You know what? If you, the folks on the call won't see it.
Okay.
If you put it in.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you folks right off the bat, there are 4 numbers that I'm going to want you to understand today. Those 4 numbers are 10, 11, 7 to 70. Okay, now those are, I'll repeat them again, 10, 11, 7 to 70. That's the key to understanding the US presidential elections, at least up until about 12 hours ago. And the reason why I say that is that there's a PowerPoint that I originally had planned on for delivering today, which is still available for you that you can request. And I know Molly will be more than happy to send that PowerPoint to you. Or if you contact me directly, I'll send it out also. But obviously, in light of what's happened in the last 12 hours, where the president has contracted, the coronavirus, I'm going to be making some changes in my talk today. So I'll be doing a little bit of tap dancing in the process here. So I still want to provide sort of a basic overview of my talk today in terms of the main things. But clearly, a lot of you have a variety of what if questions, and I want to make sure that I can address those what if questions here. But somewhere in here, I still want you to understand 10, 11, 7, 270 as the critical. So what I want to try to do today is a few different things in terms of my talk. One of them is obviously set the context for the election this year. I know all of us are talking about the presidential election, but clearly we need to be thinking broader than that election. But anyway, I'm going to set some context. Two, I know one of the popular questions that I oftentimes get is something about the polling. That a lot of us follow the polls very intensely. I want to talk a little bit about that. I obviously want to talk about the impact that both COVID-19 and, of course, George Floyd has had on the election. And then I'm going to get us into a lot of detail regarding this election and give you my sense of things to look to, things to try to anticipate in terms of understanding something about what's going to unfold perhaps over the next 31 days and beyond that in terms of the election. So there's a lot to do here, a lot to cover. Hopefully I'll make this informative and engaging and interesting for you. So part of where I want us to start first is just to remind everybody that the 2020 election is important for many different reasons this year. Obviously, of course, it's the presidential election, and those are always inherently very important. But we shouldn't forget also that there are many other things that are going on this year. For example, there are 35 U.S. Senate seats in the United States. Of those, 23 are held by Republican and the remainder by Democrats. Of that 35, Republicans hold a 53-47 lead. And the Senate is in play in terms of majority control. And again, if we have time, we can talk more about that. There's also all 435 U.S. House seats are being challenged at this point. Democrats control the House of Representatives. My easy prediction will be that the House is not going to change control. It's pretty unlikely at this point. But also don't forget several other things. Across the country, including in Minnesota, we're going to have state legislative seats up. All 201 in Minnesota are up. Across the country, many state legislatures are up for election. That's important for several reasons. First, remember, this year is a census year. We're doing the census. The House, or rather the state legislative members who are elected this year, next year get to draw the congressional district lines and the state legislative lines for the next decade. So those House seats are important, or rather state legislative seats are important. Also, we oftentimes forget about the fact that states actually are major policy players, and who we elect, not just at the national level, but at the state level is important. And so think about that. And then finally, I want to just remind everybody of two last things. Of course, elections have consequences, and who we vote for this year, who we put into office, will be entrusted to make policy and make law for us for the next couple of years. But also for some of you, this is an interesting year too. And it's the beginning of what I call the beginning of the end of the baby boomer era of American politics. For the last 30 years, the baby boomers, those roughly born between 1946 and 1960 or 1964, depending on which demographer you look at, that 78 million people have for the last 30 years been the largest generational voting bloc in American history. As of this election, the millennials and now also the Generation Z are replacing them as the largest bloc. Excuse me for a second. Sorry, they're replacing them. That the millennials and the Gen Z together constitute 37% of the voters. We know that different generations have different political preferences. And as the baby boomers exit, as they are replaced by a new generation or new generations, we are at the cusp of seeing a transformation of American politics in ways we haven't seen literally in a generation. So that's another reason to think about the importance of this election. But I want to set a context. There are two questions that I generally get when I give public presentations in the last few years. One of them is people generally turn to me and say, Isn't America more polarized now than it has ever been in American history? And the other question is the question of asking, well, can we really trust the polls anymore? Well, let me address both of those briefly because they're important for understanding the context of American politics and for understanding how you should be looking at the next 31 days in terms of what's happening. First, we're not the most polarized we've ever been in American history. There's no question that the American Civil War by far beats anything that we've ever seen today. Also, for some of you who might have lived through it, the early 1960s was an intense time of political polarization in America. That the Vietnam War divided America. We also, unfortunately, had a situation where the division in our society produced what? A president and his brother being assassinated, a civil rights leader being assassinated, and we had in the middle 1960s, 1966, urban America burning. Those were intensities. That was an intensity of polarization. But nonetheless, we can start to chart out and look at a picture of how America has changed. And if we were to go back and just entertain me for about 5 minutes to lay out this map for us to set the context for today. If we were to go back to, let's say, 1976, 78, 1980, take us back about 40 years. Let us say we hired Harris or Gallup or one of the other major survey research companies at the time and had them ask American public about a variety of questions, whether it's about social issues, communism, the economy, whatever it may be. And we plotted American public opinion on a curve, going for the most liberal responses to the most conservative. What we would get is a nearly perfect bell curve. And why that's important, that bell curve, is it suggests that the vast majority of the American public was huddled towards the center. Most people actually were grouped towards that centrist political position. Yes, there were some very liberal, some very conservative people, but most of us were towards the center. I'll teach you a political science word. That political science word is median voter. Draw a line through the dead center of that curve. What we would have is the voter who is halfway between the most liberal, halfway between the most conservative voter. And that median voter is tremendously important because if we know that American public opinion converged to the center, if we knew that most of us were there, what we also know is something that makes sense for the two major political parties back in 1976 or 1980. That if you wanted to nominate a candidate to win as president of the United States, you would nominate somebody who was closest to where most of the voters were, which means towards the center. And that's what happened. 1976, the Democrats picked Jimmy Carter, the Republicans Gerald Ford, centrist. 1980, I'm still going to say Jimmy Carter was a centrist. I'm still going to say, to some extent, Ronald Reagan was a centrist. It converged towards the center. The two parties themselves, the center of their two parties, Republican and Democrat, was not far from one another. Another political science term I teach you is that the two parties back then were what we call coalitional, not ideological. Both the Democratic and Republican parties had a mixture of liberals, moderates, and conservatives. What we would find was a Republican Party with liberals such as David Durenberger from Minnesota, or a Nelson Rockefeller, or a Jacob Javits from New York, as well as a Barry Goldwater from Arizona. The Democrats would have had a Ted Kennedy as a liberal, a Jimmy Carter towards the center, and I'm actually forgetting at this point who were some of the Southern Democrats who were really quite conservative at that point. But with the two parties being coalitional, ideologically mixed, one of the repercussions is that it was easier, and I'll talk more about this in a second, for the two parties to reach agreement. So bell-shaped curve, two parties coalitional, both parties pretty close to one another. Two other characteristics of late 1970s. About 1/3 or 120 of the seats in the U.S. House of Representatives came from swing seats. Yes, 2/3 were easily predictable as going Republican or Democrat, but the remainder came from swing seats, seats that were evenly balanced among the voters between Republicans and Democrats with a high percentage of independents. These seats were important, these 120. They were the drivers of political compromise. They forced the rest of the Democrats and Republicans to work together. These seats had to be compromisers. Why? If you came from a seat evenly balanced with your voters, Republican and Democrat, if you strayed too far left, too far right, you were out of a job the next term. Finally, 76, 78, 80, 10 to 15% of the American public considered themselves to be what? Swing voters. By swing voters at that time, we meant voters who split ticket voted. That is, maybe a Democrat for president, a Republican for governor or something like that, or one election vote Democrat, one election vote Republican. Those voters were important. This picture that I'm painting for you produced in American politics with a high degree of consensus in the late 70s. Congressionally, we saw very little legislation passing single party votes and a high percentage of legislation being adopted. Fast forward us now to 2016, 2018, 2020. Take that bell curve that I was describing to you, and now either imagine that I step on the center and push the sides out to where it's now double humped. Another way of describing it, imagine a double hump camel's back or a bimodal curve. That's American public opinion today. That what has happened is that we have seen the percentage of our population that actually lines up as moderate go down dramatically. Yes, I know. All of us like to claim that we are moderate, but by the time we actually look at our voting preferences and political preferences, we've actually separated ourselves out. Now, here is where I like to invoke one of my heroes. One of my heroes is a bank robber named Willie Sutton. Willie Sutton was famous for when asked the question once, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where all the money is. Think about why Willie Sutton is a genius when you apply him to politics. If 40 years ago, it made sense to nominate a centrist candidate for president, because that's where all the voters are, if there are fewer voters in the center, does it make sense to nominate a centrist candidate? Not anymore. Instead, what we've also seen is that the center of the Democratic and Republican parties has moved away. That's the two humps on that bimodal curve. We also know that over time, the two major parties have sorted themselves out ideologically. That it's no longer the case that we will find liberals, moderates, and conservatives in the Democratic Party or the same in the Republican. We have created much more purified, much more ideological parties. And what the two parties generally do now is to nominate a candidate at the center of where their party is. And if the two parties are moving further and further apart, that is one of the signs of our polarization. I'm going to give you a few more in a second here. We also know that 120 swing seats is now down to what? About 60 seats. I actually think it's less than 60 swing seats. There are fewer seats that are swing, fewer drivers of political compromise. And finally, no longer 10 to 15% swing voters. It's perhaps down to 5%, maybe 10%. I am of the opinion that there are no more swing voters. In this election, I think everybody's made up their minds about Trump versus Biden. The question is not who you're going to vote for, but whether you're going to vote. And we have evidence of that now. That swing voting is no longer split ticket voting, no longer vote one election Democrat, one election Republican. To be a swing voter means to be what? To swing in and vote or swing out from voting. The best predictor, or one of the best predictors of how you're going to vote, are you a Democrat or Republican? One of the best predictors of whether you're going to vote, are you a Democrat or Republican? We have become so incredibly polarized in our society. We're to the point, it's not just about what? Republicans watching Fox News, Democrats watching MSNBC. But we know that Democrats and Republicans have sorted themselves out geographically. They have sorted themselves out in terms of what restaurants they eat at, what cars they drive, the stores they shop at. From 2016, this is amazing. If we took a map of areas where Donald Trump and Republicans did well, areas where Hillary Clinton and Democrats did well, and overlaid that map with the location of Whole Foods stores, Chick-fil-A restaurants, and Cracker Barrel restaurants, almost perfect predictors of how those areas were going to vote. Or, as I sometimes tell people, if you tell me you drive a Subaru, I can make a near perfect prediction on how you're going to vote. You tell me you shop at Gander Mountain, I can give you nearly a perfect prediction on how you're going to vote. This is speaking to our degree of polarization out here. So this, I think, becomes really fascinating to think about in terms of our patterns here. And this pattern of polarization has also produced what? A Congress where now the single most liberal voting Republican still votes more conservatively than the single most conservative voting Democrat. That we also know that the amount of legislation passed has gone down dramatically. And the percentage of legislation that's bipartisan has also gone down. I know Dave has a question for me I'm going to get to about astronomy in a little while here. Don't let me forget that at some point here. Okay, so we've got this pattern of polarization, and this is important to understand because I eventually want people to understand that we are so polarized that this sets the context for everything. How we view the economy, how we view wearing of face masks, opening and closing of the business, George Floyd, and it's also going to tell us something about how close I think this election actually really is. So Brent asks, given what you've described as hyperpolarization of the 60s and the bell curve electorate in the 70s, do you envision anything that would moderate today's polarization, have a center reemerge? Yes, great question here. And there's two things that are happening here. Okay. When I mentioned to you that the traditional swing voter in terms of split ticket voting at all has disappeared, what has emerged are the swing voters who swing in or swing out from voting. And what I'm going to tell you now is true, and it's been true for several years. The single most important swing voter in American politics, the most powerful voter, is what? Is college-educated suburban women. I'm talking about, let us say, women who live in, let's say, Edina, Wayzata, Golden Valley. And the reason why I mention this is that about a generation ago, maybe 30 years ago, these women were voting Republican, but they moved away from the Republican Party. And we have data that substantiates this. Initially, it was about reproductive choice issues. Eventually, it became not just reproductive rights, but what I call family security issues. These women, and I know it sounds sexist, but the polls substantiate this. These women care about what? Safe schools, quality of schools. They care about health types of issues. I call those family security issues. The Republicans haven't been talking about those issues in ways that these suburban women find acceptable, and they've moved away from the Republican Party. They haven't necessarily become Democrats, at least all of them, but they're certainly not Republicans. And we know that what those suburban women do has a huge outcome on the elections. In 2016, those suburban women largely stayed home in an election that featured Trump versus Clinton. And there were a variety of reasons why those suburban women didn't like either of them. But in 2018, and therefore Trump won, but in 2018, those suburban women showed up in high percentages to vote, partly because of, let's say, dislike of Trump, partly because of the Brett Kavanaugh, Dr. Ford Supreme Court confirmation hearings. But they certainly showed up. And one of the questions this year I'm going to come back to is, what will those women do this year? But more focused for you is that if those suburban college-educated women, and we know women are now the majority of the electorate, if they become a mainstay of the Democratic Party, They may be socially liberal, but they are fiscally moderate or conservative. That they could provide or prove to be the anchor for a new center in American politics. Alternatively, and it's a whole different subject, but I'll mention it briefly because there's a book I'm working on right now. Over the next 10 years, the baby boom generation, as I mentioned to you, and the silent generation will exit from the political system, replaced by mostly millennials and Gen Z. And there's evidence about a decade out that we'll see a new political consensus in America. What's fascinating, and there's a great piece in Foreign Affairs magazine this month that points this out, is that these new generations coming up, for good or for bad, and it's not my goal to talk about that in terms of good or bad. The new generations coming up are the least religious in American history. Barely 50% of the new generations coming up ascribe to saying they're Christian, believe in God, or a member of an organized church. The United States has rapidly secularized among all countries in the world, more so than any other country in the world in the last 10, 15 years. Take away the religiosity, which is a big driver of polarization in America. It also portends a sign of what? Of a new political consensus. Okay, good. So keep this in mind, this polarization. The other thing I want to briefly mention, then I want to walk through a variety of other things. I still want to leave about 20 minutes for a lot of conversation and questions and answers here. A lot of people also say to me, well, the polls were all wrong 4 years ago. No one saw that Trump was going to win. And the response that I give is to say that no, the polls largely had it right. The analysts got it wrong. The polls said that Clinton was going to win the national popular vote by about 2 to 3 percentage points, plus or minus a couple points. And that's exactly what wound up happening. So the polls got it right. But as I want to tell you now, ignore every national poll for presidential elections. Why? We don't vote for people on the basis of the national popular vote. It's about the Electoral College. That's what it's about. And that's my first number, 270. Everything you need to start to know about the American presidential race is about what? The fact that the American presidential election is about a 50-state race plus the District of Columbia. It is an effort to gather the majority of the 538 electoral votes. That is 270. Across the country, in 48 of 50 states, the electoral votes are awarded on a winner-take-all fashion. Whichever candidate gets the plurality of the popular vote gets all the electoral votes in that state. And that is important to understand in terms of that. What was missing 4 years ago was people looking at state level polling. I was looking at polling in places like Pennsylvania, in places like North Carolina, and you could see what was happening in the closing days of the election as undecided voters broke against Hillary Clinton and broke in favor of Donald Trump, what few there were. And I would say that back then, 4 years ago, there were far more undecided voters than there are now. The polls are suggesting now that barely 3 or 4% nationally and in many of the states are really undecided at this point. So ignore all national polls, never pay attention to them. Look for the presidential, look at the state level. All right. Now, also, one other thing, and I'm going to start to give you some numbers here, fill in the rest of those numbers here, is that think about if I had given this Leo lecture 6 months ago, and let's say Molly or Brent or somebody said to me, what's the most important issue that's going to affect the 2020 presidential election? And what I would have said to you at that point is that clearly the most important issue, excuse me for a second, clearly the most important issue would have been what? The failed impeachment of Donald Trump in the Senate. Do you all remember that? Back in February, there was an impeachment trial. It seems like an eternity ago. No one's talking about it. Just nobody's talking about it. I'm going to get to Tim's question in a minute here too, in terms of here. But clearly what has happened is that that's no longer the issue. I would have said that what the issue was back then, besides the Senate, election was what? Donald Trump himself. In 2016, Trump versus Clinton, what that election was really about was character. And what Trump was successful in doing is making Hillary Clinton's character the issue, whether it was the emails or other things. In 2018, Donald Trump, even though he wasn't on the ballot officially, his character was on trial. This election, I would suggest to you, was and still is primarily about Donald Trump and his character. People are saying, but what about the coronavirus? What about the economy? What about obviously the coronavirus? What about George Floyd? And I would say that those are still surrogate issues for how you view Donald Trump. That across the board, there's a partisan divide on what's the state of the economy, who's to blame. Same thing in terms of George Floyd, in terms of what it means, especially after the after events after George Floyd. And so to a large extent, I would say that coronavirus, George Floyd changed everything and nothing. They changed everything in terms of putting those issues on the agenda. They changed nothing in the sense that they're a surrogate. Where they did change things, I'm going to argue where the coronavirus changed things is in terms of voting. Less in terms of being a substantive new issue, except perhaps maybe now in the last 12 hours, it's become a more salient issue with the president being, now being symptomatic. It's the last that I heard about an hour ago. But where the coronavirus has kicked in is in terms of how we vote. And again, there's a partisan divide here. That the president has criticized mail-in voting, has criticized it and raised questions about fraud, trying not to venture into this too much politically. I'll simply say that most of us have a better chance of buying a Powerball ticket and winning than showing that voter fraud, either in person or absentee, is a significant factor affecting the election. There's been numerous studies on those. If people want them, I could pass them on to you. But nonetheless, what we have is that overwhelmingly right now, Democrats are requesting absentee ballots to vote early. Republicans are not. This is setting us up for something fascinating. A situation where we could have an election where the results from the absentees are different than election day. Back in 2004, we have evidence that John Kerry won the election on election day, but George Bush did such a great job getting early voting in. Add it all up together, he wins. 2012, we have great evidence that Mitt Romney won on election day, but Barack Obama did such a great job that instead, put it all together, he won. We could have a very split election this year where the results we get on the 3rd of November are clearly not conclusive, clearly not the final story, and it may take us, and that's likely, several days, maybe a few weeks to get the answer, which also suggests and shows us the divide when it comes to voting. We also know, as part of understanding this, and I'm going to get to the question about turnout in a second here, we also know that going into the election, this is the most heavily litigated presidential election in American history. Suits about early voting, suits about timing for absentee ballots and so forth. I can very well see significant lawsuits, challenges coming after the election too, as the ballots are being counted and as we fight this out. Okay, so quick question here from Tim. What about the voter turnout impact on the election for POTUS? Is it accurate to state that racial minorities, as well as many Democrats, sat out the 2016 election? Thus, does the higher voter turnout in 2020 bode well for Biden? Yes. One of the stories that's true about 2016 is that Democrats did stay home. Now, in Minnesota, for example, Donald Trump only got about 2,000 more votes in 2016 than Mitt Romney got in 2012. The real story was what? Democrats staying home in Hennepin County, in Ramsey County. But go to some of the other critical states, such as Wayne County in Michigan, or let us say Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, Cuyahoga County in Ohio. Democrats stayed home. Now, part of it was that the Bernie supporters were not excited by Hillary Clinton, but also Hillary Clinton made strategic campaign mistakes. Mistakes, for example, in Minnesota, she loses to Bernie Sanders in the caucus, never comes back to campaign in the general election. Loses to Bernie Sanders in Wisconsin and Michigan, never comes back in the general election to campaign. Assumes that those 3 states are in the Democratic fold. She loses 2 of them and almost the third. So some of what happened was, I think Clinton made some strategic mistakes, made some mistakes. She also wasn't popular with younger voters in the Democratic Party. That cost her problems. And I will also say she was a victim of sex discrimination. 2016, going into the election, I said to people that what percentage of the American public do you think won't vote for a woman, any woman for president? And I said, I think it's 30%, too high, too low, about right. Everybody thought I was too high. I think I was too low. I still think there's about 35% of the population that won't vote for a woman for president. I'm going to get to the Green Bay Packers comment also here too, and also going to get to the COVID issue in a couple minutes here too. We're all going to get it all put together in the next 5 minutes here or so. So thinking in terms of what I'm saying here is that about the litigation. I now want to switch gears one more so I can get to those 4 numbers and give you my sense of where the election is still at this point. All right. Having talked about polling, polarization, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Stacey Hunter Hecht, who used to teach at Bethel College until she passed away untimely at age 47 from breast cancer. And I want to give her acknowledgement. I love Stacey dearly. We did a book a few years ago called Presidential Swing States. And the premise of our book, and it's now in a 2nd edition, going to a 3rd, is that because of the polarization in America, because of the spatial distribution of Democrats and Republicans across the country, where some states are more Democratic, some are more Republican, and because of the winner-take-all feature of the Electoral College, what we said was that before the 2016 election, the presidential race was over in 40 states. We knew what was going to happen in New York, California, Texas, Louisiana. That if you were a Democrat in Texas, a Republican in New York, you might as well stay home on election day. Your vote didn't matter. Well, going into this election, I'm making the initial argument that the election was over, let's say, several months ago in 43 states. That this election is down to what? 7 states. Those 7, Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Those are the 7 states. As I calculate it right now, remember I told you need 270 electoral votes to win? Right now, my calculation is Joe Biden has 222 electoral votes. My calculation is right now that Donald Trump has 205. Neither of them have the 270 you need to win. There are 7 states that have 111 electoral votes that will decide the election. So that 7 is my 2nd number here. Now, within those 7 states, what we have found in our research is that within each of those critical 7 states, there are certain what we call swing counties that drive the election. These are counties that are so populous or so critical that whoever wins that county probably wins that state. So for example, for those of you who are familiar with Arizona, win Maricopa County, you win probably Arizona. For those of you who know Florida, win Hillsborough or Pinellas, you win that state. In Michigan, win Wayne. North Carolina, Wake County. And in Wisconsin, it is probably Brown County. That's the bellwether. Now, Brown County is where Green Bay is. And I'm going to come back to that point in a second here. So there are critical swing counties, 11 of them, in those 7 states. But we also know that within those counties, there's a small number, about 10% of the voters that are undecided that might decide the election. So what happens? I'm arguing this year, 10% of the voters located in 11 counties dispersed across 7 states determine it gets to 270 electoral votes. That's not a lot of people, folks. And I give you this number because it speaks to how polarized we are. Now I'm going to make it even worse or even better. 2 summers ago, I was blessed. I had a high school student from Lakeville High School who called me up and said, can I work with you for the summer to figure out what it's like to be in college? And I said, sure, come on up. I'd love to have you work with me. And we did some calculations and found that there are certain swing precincts within swing counties. It may be that there's only 10% of the voters in a few swing precincts in a few 11 counties within 7 states that determine how it's get to 270. By the way, in Minnesota, the swing county, I'm going to give you a couple of possibilities here. One is obviously Hennepin County. If the turnout in Hennepin County improves compared to what it was 4 years ago, then Donald Trump doesn't have much of a chance. Hennepin County, the voter turnout collapsed, significantly collapsed 4 years ago, and that's Democratic territory. Another possibility is that Kandiyohi County, which is where Wilmer is such a great bellwether, excuse me, sorry, predictor county for Minnesota. I might look to that. I think it's roll call, I think, is saying Washington County is a predictor. Maybe I'm not quite as persuaded. Another possibility is Anoka County. Yes, a possibility that Republicans do well when turnout is high in Anoka County. All possibilities. Yet another one is Mauer, where Austin, Minnesota is. Austin used to be solidly Democratic for many, many years. It was Hormel, it was Union. In 2016, it flipped Republican. In 2018, it flipped back Democrat. All of those might be possibilities, but I would still go with Hennepin in terms of what I want to locate here. Now, I'm going to tighten this even more, and then I'm just about done with my presentation, and I'll get to questions and so forth here. Okay, one way of also thinking about this election is to say those are the 7 swing states. We know the candidates are spending their time campaigning there. Why was Trump in Minnesota a couple of days ago? Why was he going to go to Wisconsin? Why was he going to head to Florida this weekend? Those are the states that matter. Now, when prior to the early this morning's news about the president being infected, if I were looking at the polling data, and again, at the state level, what I would have argued is that even though it's close, Trump was probably going to still win Florida, probably going to still win North Carolina, probably going to still win Arizona. Biden was going to probably pick up and hold Minnesota, although it's close, was going to win Pennsylvania, his original home state, and probably Michigan. The wild card was Wisconsin. Many analysts are saying it's all about Wisconsin. And if that's true, now this is the part that becomes the one that we should be talking about here. And if you're a Vikings fan, you're going to hate what I have to say here. If in fact, as Brown County goes, so goes Wisconsin, and Green Bay is in Brown County, this might suggest that Packers fans are going to decide the next president of the United States. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on the Packers versus Vikings rivalry. I'll just simply say I'm living in Minnesota now and let it go as that in terms of it. But it is possible it's that one state. It is also possible that it's just one county, Brown County, that decides it. 4 years ago, I did a piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it was called As Scranton Goes, So Goes the Nation. And Scranton, Joe Biden's from there. My family, my mother's side of the family is from Scranton, so I know it well. It's a traditional mining, blue-collar area, a little bit like the Iron Range in Minnesota. And Democrats had historically won it by 20 or more percentage points. Barack Obama won it by over 20 points. I did a piece in the Inquirer that said that if Trump were to win Lackawanna County, that's where Scranton is, or get close to winning it, he would win Pennsylvania. If he wins Pennsylvania, he wins the presidency. Clinton only held Lackawanna County by 2 percentage points. Trump goes on to win Pennsylvania, goes on to win the presidential election in the Electoral College. It could be that. It could be that county. Yet another way of describing it here, 2 other ways. One is to say that if in 2016, had 85,000 more Democrats voted in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, Secretary Clinton would be president now. Notice I said more Democrats. It's not a shifting of votes. It would have been more Democrats. Now, that's a possibility, 85,000. But here is where I think another way of thinking about this race comes down to. Comes down to this. For Joe Biden, for him to win, he needs to motivate heavily college-educated suburban women in, I'm going to say, probably at the end of the day, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Donald Trump needs to heavily motivate white working class males without a college degree in those same 3 states. The intersection of the turnout of those 2 groups in those 3 states tells us who's going to win. In real numbers, I think this election is down to what about 10,000 to 20,000 people actually do. That speaks to how close the election is, about the polarization. That I think is interesting. Okay, so I want to get to a few different things here. Okay, so one of them here is just thinking about it here in terms of what impact does COVID-19 have, or need to be put on a ventilator, where it could have on the move of the election. Okay, first off, the November 3rd election cannot be moved except by congressional statute. So the president never had authority to do that. It would take a congressional statute or law to do this. But if the election were delayed, the Constitution says that the president's term of office and vice president's term of office expires at noon on January 20th of next year. So if it's delayed, no matter what happens, the current term expires. And so let us say we push the election out to December or something like that, we run into a constitutional clock. Other things to think about here, and I was writing this up this morning to put on my blog to kind of lay out what the law says here. There's a variety of things that could happen here. Okay, so let's think it through. So one of them is what were to happen, and we all hope it doesn't. We all hope that we wish the president well. But let's say he were to die between now and election day, or not election day, between now and January 20th. The Constitution is clear. Mike Pence becomes president of the United States. Okay, what if he becomes incapacitated? The president could either send a letter to Congress, that is the Speaker of the House and President pro tem, saying, I'm temporarily turning my powers of presidency over to the vice president, and therefore Pence serves as acting president. Or let us say the president were to, again, turn very ill, let's say today. And again, we hope not. And he can't communicate to Congress. If the vice president and a majority of the cabinet transmit a letter to Congress saying the president's incapacitated, then the vice president also steps in. So in terms of what to do for, let us say, between now and January 20th for line of succession, or if the president is incapacitated, we're in pretty good shape in terms of what the law says. What becomes more complicated now is, let's say, again, he becomes seriously ill between now and election day, or again, hopefully not, he passes away. What happens? First, what can the Republican Party do about replacing him? Rule 9 of the Republican National Committee allows for the executive committee to be able to pick a replacement candidate for the president if there's a vacancy. What that means is that Pence doesn't automatically become the Republican presidential candidate if Donald Trump were incapacitated, had to be or died. There would have to be a Republican National Committee to replace. That still is pretty easy to do. But now the complexity is we've had millions of early ballots voted. Most states have got their ballots printed up. What happens at this point? What happens about voting? Well, that becomes a question of state law in terms of how those ballots are counted. Will the ballots for Trump, assuming it's Pence for now, is his replacement, will the votes for Trump automatically translate over to Pence? Not necessarily the case. In Minnesota, some of you might recall, nearly 20 years ago, when 11 days before the election, Paul Wellstone died and was replaced by Walter Mondale. There were 25,000 early ballots, and the Minnesota Supreme Court said you could not automatically transfer votes from Wellstone to Mondale. You had to give people an opportunity to re-vote. Now, that was the Minnesota rule. I can't speak to what the other 49 states are going to do. But now let me lay out a couple more scenarios. Let's say Trump passes away after Election Day. Well, if he passes away after December 14th, it's a piece of cake. At that point, Pence becomes president to fill out the remainder of the term. If Trump has won the election, after December 14th is when the Electoral College meets. And at that point, the electors cast their votes and the Constitution's clear. Pence becomes not just acting president, but becomes president as of January 20th. Obviously, if Trump were to pass away and Biden were to have won, still no problem here. But what if Trump dies after November 3rd, but before the electors meet? Then that becomes more complicated, because in some states, electors are still compelled to vote for the person on the ballot if they won the state. Some states, they're free. Again, this becomes a matter of state law. Okay, so let's assume Trump wins the election and Congress says the same. Are we going to have 4 more years of dysfunctional government, or will Congress realize they have to work together and govern? Well, this becomes an interesting question no matter what, because even if, under the scenarios that I would sketch out here, let's say Trump were to win, that the Republicans hold the Senate and Democrats hold the House. We're still going to have, as you say, the dysfunctionalism. If Biden wins, Republicans hold the Senate, Democrats hold the House, we're still going to have that dysfunctionalism. If the Democrats do a clean sweep, unless they repeal the filibuster rule, we're still going to have this partisan split. So we have a variety of scenarios that are out there in terms of what could still happen at this point. Short of a clean sweep and a repeal of the filibuster rule, which requires what? That right now the filibuster says that any one senator can prevent legislation from moving forward unless 60 senators vote to close debate. Unless that rule is repealed, there's nobody that's envisioning Republicans or Democrats getting 60 votes in the Senate. So switch gears. What led you to astronomy? I actually started off college as an astronomer, wanted to do particle physics and planetary astronomy. And this is, I think, I tell this story to my students at Hamline all the time. I realized early on that I was not a genius in math. To be a good astronomer, you had to be a genius in math. And I said, well, this is not what I can do and probably do well, but I got excited by politics and moved over there. And all of us should be open to the fact that we should change our minds, be open to the idea that education alters our preferences. But I've always done amateur astronomy. If anybody comes to my house over in St. Paul, I've got too many telescopes in my garage. But I think it was about 15 years ago, in Sky and Telescope magazine, which is sort of the amateur astronomers magazine, there was a school indicating that you could apply for a master, that you could study distance for astronomy. So I said, sure. I thought, I'll take one class. I took my first class, did okay. My second class did okay, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually I got a master's degree in astronomy. Now, I will still say that I struggled with the math. And I made the right career choice in life, but I'm proud of what I did in getting that degree. I should also say that my master's degree in astronomy, if you go to Amazon, I got published as a book, and it's all about Andromeda Galaxy. So I'm so proud of that still. Okay, so who else? I think we still have time, 5 minutes, Molly, hopefully for some questions.
Yeah, we have time for more questions, but I just want to, David, 10 to 20,000 votes across the country.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah. I am not quite to the point yet of saying how Harry and Louise vote on Elm Street, and let us say in Green Bay, Wisconsin, drive the election. But my whole point in talking about the polarization going in was to point out how polarized, how fixed our preferences are, and how we're at to the point where what? It's really a very few number of votes. And again, if 3 years ago it was 85,000 votes in 3 states, and we're even more polarized now than we were then. And we have better data now than we'd had back then about the degree of polarization. It's that tight. And that's why, think about it. If I'm right, it's the logic of small numbers. And this is the part where the polls can't capture it. Where if we're talking about moving 10 or 20,000 people in 3 states, the polls aren't going to catch that, even at the state level. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you say anything about the impact of campaigning if a large number of people in the race right now, if Biden and his team, if folks need to quarantine, if campaigns effectively need to go on some kind of pause?
Yeah. I mean,
Does that make an impact or no?
yeah, it does. First off, I'll say campaigns matter. That's the point I was making about Clinton. 4 years ago when she opted not to come back to Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Michigan, but Trump came back to those states, that mattered. So for a lot of people who do predictions on elections seem to think candidate message and campaign doesn't matter. I'm one who still believes they do matter. And my alter ego many years ago, I used to manage and work on political campaigns. And so I do see that impact. But let's say now, Trump can't campaign for the next 2 weeks and can't do those rallies. It's clearly going to affect the issue of, let's say, the enthusiasm, the get out the vote, et cetera, et cetera. And this has been a danger, I think, right now, before that again, not criticizing Biden, but Biden has been more cautious, and that partly has maybe explained some differences in some of the polling data in some states. Now, I got to say something else here. I got to do one other kind of humorous story here. All right, that one of the things that Trump has going for him, or did go for him up until very recently, is that the Republicans are more enthusiastic about him than the Democrats are enthusiastic about Biden. And we just know that in the polling data, that there are a lot of younger people, people on the political left who are like not thrilled by Biden, et cetera, et cetera. That enthusiasm factor is critical. Now, here's a funny story I want to tell everybody here. So about 2 weeks ago, I was talking to a reporter for the U.S. News and World Report, and I've talked to her quite a bit over the few years, and she said, "Well, how would you describe the enthusiasm gap?" And I said, "Well, for Biden," and I said, "Biden reminds me." And by the way, I'm not picking anybody. It's a way of capturing it here. I said, what Biden reminds me of is back when I was in high school, and you had sort of that, and I'm putting it in different language here, the girl you really wanted to go to the prom with. You weren't sure if she was going to say yes, but you had the safe date next door just in case. And this reporter from U.S. News and World Report came back. She says, "No, I got a better one." I said, "What is it?" She says, "Joe Biden is the safe boy you bring back to your parents, to meet the parents." And again, it's not picking on him, but Biden is the safe choice for the Democrats. Many people are saying that if he were to get elected, he is the transition. He's the one-term transition candidate to where what? It now becomes Kamala Harris, who's probably the candidate in 4 years. But that speaks to the enthusiasm issue. So just changing the campaigning tactics, maybe one less rally, maybe having just to be on Twitter or Facebook, that could change the complexion of the election.
2 more questions if you have time.
Sure.
And
yeah,
folks,
one is how many, okay, I
yep.
see is that the one, how many dollars are being spent for each of those 20? Okay. The way I like to describe a presidential election is that it's like running a billion-dollar corporation for 1 year. That's approximately how much candidates raise and spend. But by the time you then add in what political action committees and third-party organizations and outside spending is we look at presidential elections as about $4 to $5 billion. We don't know this year what it's going to be because it's not over. So if I'm right, what is it? We're looking at about $5 billion being, let's say $4 billion being spent to 10 to 20,000 votes. I mean, my joke has always been dinner and a movie for every undecided voter would be a lot cheaper. We also know, by the way, the vast majority of this money that's being raised and spent in presidential campaigns is spent on television advertising. Molly, you and I are in the wrong business. You know, we should be working for television stations in swing states selling advertising space and on commission. That's where the money is at this point.
Okay, I'm gonna throw one more question to you. And just a reminder to everybody, if we didn't get to all the questions and you will have others, go ahead and send them our way after the fact. David, how will the public accept election results? Let's end with an easy one for you.
Yeah, boy. Unfortunately, the polarization is so great that we may have a lot of disagreement after election day. Having said that, no, we're not going to have tanks in the streets. I don't think we're going to have rebellion. But part of the consequences, unfortunately, of our American politics right now is we don't have gracious winners and gracious losers right now. I thought Joe Biden the other night, and again, staying out of this partisanly, when Joe Biden said something to the effect the other night in the debate. Remember, there was a debate the other night, and we all forgotten about it, where Joe Biden said, guess what? If I win, it's over. If you win, or if you win, it's over. And also said, if you lose, you lose. At the end of the day, I think that's what's going to happen. But clearly, we may not have the results on election day, and it may take several days. And my advice to everybody is we have to be patient.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time today.
No
I think
problem.
we all appreciate your time today. Who could have predicted? So with that, we're going to wrap up our Leo lecture. I think, David, I think you mentioned that it's okay. We're going to send out the PowerPoint that you referenced early on. So folks, those of you who registered for today, you all registered for today. We'll send it to you by email. Folks who are watching this after the fact can email alum@Hamline, and we can send it to you that way as well. Like I said, send questions our way if you have them. And thank you again, everybody. Thank you, David. Thanks everybody for joining, and have a safe and happy weekend.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.